The PlayStation 2 was undoubtedly the best console for horror games ever. From classics like Silent Hill 2 and Resident Evil 4 to more underrated titles like Manhunt or Siren, the PS2 had some of the most interesting and memorable horror games out there. But why do people seem to enjoy these older horror games so much? What makes them so scary compared to their modern counterparts, other than their insanely high price tag? As a casual horror enjoyer, I wanted to find out the answers to these questions. And since I recently got my hands on a PS2 emulator, I thought it'd be perfect to check out some old and possibly forgotten PS2 horror games that caught my interest. We're gonna be going through these games in a specific order, starting from ones you might know and then moving on to the more obscure ones you probably haven't heard of. So let's get into it. One of the lesser known PS2 horror games that I've tried out so far is Obscure. Released back in 2004 and developed by the French studio Hydravision, Obscure was, well, a pretty obscure release. In Obscure, you play as 5 protagonists, all students at Leafmore High. After a brief cutscene featuring our protagonists shooting hoops to an angsty early 2000s punk rock track, the plot of the game begins after Kenny, one of the main characters, decides to stay out a bit later to practice and makes plans to go on a date with his girlfriend Ashley later that night. When Kenny finishes his call with Ashley though, he notices that his bag is missing, and since it was there a second ago, he figures that someone has just stolen it, so he starts chasing after the thief, who leads him out into the courtyard and towards the gardens located behind the school's gym. Kenny then follows him into the basement of a rundown house behind the school for some reason, because why the hell not, I guess. Once inside, he finds a ladder leading down, along with a flashlight and a gun, which he grabs before heading further underground. At the bottom, he discovers some sort of secret underground lab filled with cages, where it seems like someone has been conducting all types of weird experiments on people. Inside one of the rooms, he finds a student who's been held captive, and they try to escape together. But of course, they can't just make it out unscathed, because, you know, the game's gotta go on. They get attacked by some weird-looking mutant creature, and while Kenny tries to climb the ladder to escape, the entrance to the lab is sealed shut, trapping him down there. The following day, our remaining protagonists are pretty worried about Kenny not making it home the previous night, so they decide to stay at the school after hours to search for him, thinking it would be smarter to work backwards from where they last saw him to try to find him. However, that's when they discover the slightly concerning fact that there is some sort of infestation of bloodthirsty, mutated creatures at their school. The best way I could describe Obscure is essentially an old-school Resident Evil style game, but with a high school setting. Throughout the game, you go around exploring the school campus, including locations like the library, all the classrooms, the dorms, the theater, the gym, and finally, the secret underground lab. And I have to say, I really enjoyed the atmosphere of Obscure. First of all, the ambient noises were scary as hell. Every now and then, you'd hear random screams or other loud noises in the distance, which definitely keeps you on your toes a bit. Also, the setting of the game being a high school paired with the old early 2000s graphics just works so goddamn well in my opinion, and you can tell they put a lot of effort into designing the environments you'll go through during the course of the game. This game definitely has a lot of flaws, but its aesthetic is pretty fire, I can't lie. What makes Obscure unique, especially in the survival horror genre, is the fact that it features a split-screen co-op mode so you can play with friends, or you can just play with the default AI companion. The AI companion feature works surprisingly well, with simple commands like follow, wait, and help, where the AI guides you to points of interest. An important aspect of the game is that if a character dies, they're gone for good, so you have to be careful while fighting, or just go back to your previous saves a lot. In Obscure, you get 5 characters to choose from, and you play as 2 at a time, with you controlling one while the other one just kind of follows you around. The characters are basically 2000s high school archetypes. You've got Kenny, who's basically the athletic jock, Stan, the laid-back stoner guy that doesn't even realize monsters invaded the school, Josh, the nerdy journalist guy, Shannon, Kenny's annoying sister who's always complaining, and finally, we've got Ashley, Kenny's girlfriend who's also a cheerleader. Each of the characters has their own special abilities, ranging from stronger attacks, the ability to sprint, and instant lockpicking certain doors and lockers, so it's good to use different characters in different situations. As for the combat, it's quite basic, having an auto-locking onto enemies mechanic, power attacks, and standard attacks. However, I think that's probably all the game needs. The controls are pretty easy to learn, and to be honest, there's no need for unnecessary complexity anyway in a game like this. All in all, the storyline of Obscura is pretty corny. The characters and the setting are very cliche, but it also doesn't take itself too seriously, and that makes the game have a certain charm to it, in my opinion. It's also pretty fun to see that overused trope in horror media, where everything starts off normal, but gradually descends into chaos, and then you have to fight to uncover the mystery behind everything that's happening. It's pretty cheesy, but I kinda like it, to be honest. Overall, I would highly recommend this game, especially if you're a fan of the classic Resident Evil games. Even though it doesn't do anything groundbreaking, it's a cool little game that is definitely entertaining enough for the couple of hours it takes to finish. One of the scariest games I've played recently was Fatal Frame 1. As some of you might know, Fatal Frame is a survival horror series developed by Tecmo, with the first installment, and the one which I played, released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2. Although I had heard of Fatal Frame before, I wasn't exactly sure what to expect when diving into it. I knew it had a reputation for being one of the most genuinely scary games on the PS2, but I had no idea just how intense and creepy it would actually be. In Fatal Frame, you play as two siblings. You begin the game as a guy named Fuyu, as he's about to enter a mansion in the middle of the woods. We hear a narration from his sister Miku explaining that he was searching for a famous novelist who disappeared along with his colleagues while researching for his newest book. This led Mafuyu to go to his last known whereabouts, a place called Himuro Mansion. However, just like the novelist, Mafuyu also disappears while he's there. After losing contact with him, it's up to his sister Miku, who is our main protagonist, to go there herself to discover what happened to her brother and the rest of the people who disappeared. From the moment you step foot into the mansion, you're immediately immersed in the game's unsettling atmosphere. Fatal Frame 1 is genuinely a creepy ass game. Like many other games from around that time, the visuals haven't exactly aged that well. That is, if you prefer the hyper-realistic visuals games strive for nowadays. But if you're like me and you can appreciate the beautiful PS2 era style graphics, you're definitely going to love this game's visual aesthetic. These old games just have a certain charm to them in general, where they manage to look good while still looking very video gamey, if that makes sense. Apart from that though, I do think that the old and dated graphics actually add to the creepiness of the game in many ways. Like for example, making certain objects and many of the enemies harder to see and distinguish, which makes the experience a lot scarier. The ambient sounds in Fatal Frame are also insanely creepy. They are a mix of voices layered on top of each other and all types of other weird sounds that play as you move from room to room. Mostly haunting noises like disembodied moans, screams, or various rattling objects and random noises. And I also saw somewhere that if you're playing with a controller, it will even vibrate ever so slightly at times, putting you on edge and making it feel like something is going to happen or someone's gonna pop out. The main thing that will keep you preoccupied, however, are of course the ghosts. While Resident Evil has zombies and Silent Hill has different types of monsters, director Makoto Shibata's vision was to make the scariest horror game, and to do that, he wanted to delve into a particular fear that is deeply rooted in Japanese culture to match the overall Japanese aesthetic of the game, and that is ghosts. Fatal Frame's ghosts are some of the most terrifying enemies ever to grace a video game. From the non-hostile ghosts you encounter in the environment as you explore, to the ones that lunge at you and you have to fight, each encounter is scary as hell, and there were very few instances where I felt safe or relaxed while playing this game. Ghosts in Fatal Frame are extremely aggressive, and a lot of times they randomly appear in front of you when you're just walking around or backtracking. Now let's delve a bit into the combat mechanics of the game. The camera obscura serves as your only defense against the ghosts throughout the entire game. This camera possesses supernatural properties that enable it to detect ghosts in the environment. Therefore, much of the gameplay, including combat and exploration, revolves around utilizing the camera obscura. So when you aim the camera, you must align the ghost within the circular reticle. This then fills up a bar at the bottom of the screen, which powers your shot, and once you reach maximum charge, you have to take a picture of the ghost to deal damage to it. However, the closer you are to an enemy, the faster the meter will charge. So if you want to take down an enemy quickly, you actually have to put yourself in danger and get close to the ghost. The very way you fight forces you to stare directly into the face of the thing currently scaring you and hold your ground. There's also a good amount of depth to the combat system, like different types of film for the camera obscura will do differing amounts of damage, and as you defeat different ghosts, you'll gain spirit power, which works kind of like experience points. The more spirit power you have, the more you'll get to upgrade your camera, making it even more effective in terms of range, speed, and and damage, as well as granting it access to special secondary powers like the ability to automatically track ghosts, push them away from you with a shot, or paralyze them outright, among other things. By far, the biggest challenge I faced while playing the game was getting used to the somewhat confusing first-person controls of the camera, which was made way harder since I was playing on keyboard and not controller, and I had to find a way to make the keybinds actually somewhat playable. Other than that, the movement can also be very janky and frustrating at times, and basically there's a lot of annoying collision issues like that where the models of the furniture and other objects stick out further than they visibly seem to in a lot of rooms. In a 2008 interview reflecting on the franchise, Shibata described the two core elements of Fatal Frame that helped shape the vision for the first game and eventually the entire franchise. He said, and I quote, "When I first proposed the idea for Fatal Frame, I incorporated two elements that I suppose you could say are the rough blueprint for any Fatal Frame game. For one, I wanted the game to take place in a Japanese traditional style house. In those kinds of old-fashioned houses, there are a lot of nooks and crannies and areas tucked behind sliding screens and doors that are too dark to see. I wanted to make a horror game that capitalized on that darkness. A horror game where just standing there, you felt afraid. Secondly, I wanted there to be some kind of mechanic that requires you to capture the ghosts. When you're looking at something scary like a ghost or a spirit, you don't really want to look directly at it, right? But I wanted to create a system that meant if you didn't directly face the ghosts, you wouldn't be able to defeat them. And this is how the idea of using a camera to capture the ghost was born." Fatal Frame stands as a true masterpiece in the survival horror genre, especially considering its age. Its visuals, atmosphere, and gameplay have aged beautifully in my opinion, and I definitely enjoyed playing it. If you're a fan of survival horror or just searching for a game that'll keep you on edge and actually scare you, look no further. One of the more underrated survival horror games that I got to play was Haunting Ground. This game genuinely surprised me with how good it was, since I hadn't even heard of it since recently. Developed by Capcom and released on the PS2 back in 2005, Haunting Ground has some very unique qualities to it, which I think sets it apart from other survival horror games like Silent Hill or Resident Evil. You play as Fiona Belly, a young woman who wakes up inside a cage in a creepy old castle following a car accident. Dressed in nothing but a bedsheet, she quickly realizes she's in a bad situation with no memory of how she got there. The castle that you find yourself in is full of secrets that you have to slowly piece together to discover the truth about how and why you're there, while at the same time, you're constantly stalked and chased by the castle's inhabitants. What sets Haunting Ground apart from other survival horror games is its emphasis on vulnerability. What I mean by that is that Fiona isn't your typical horror protagonist. She's not equipped with any guns or knives and doesn't have any combat skills. Instead, you have to rely on running, hiding, and outsmarting your enemies. The game's core mechanic revolves around Fiona's panic levels. If she gets too scared, her vision blurs, her movements become erratic, and she's harder to control. I think this feature does a very good job of adding an extra layer of realism and tension to the game, because unlike other horror games where the protagonist is ready to defend themselves with some weapon they picked up against some demonic monster, Fiona's reaction is basically what most of us would feel if we were thrown in a similar situation. Straight up fear. And that makes every enemy encounter feel genuinely terrifying. The only real weapon that Fiona has to actually defend herself is a dog named Huey. You can command Huey to attack enemies who are chasing you, fetch items, and help solve puzzles. The bond you form with Huey is crucial to your survival, and Huey is fiercely loyal to Fiona if trained correctly, but if neglected and abused, he will disobey her and leave her helpless against enemies, or he may even attack her. The way you train Huey is by praising him when he follows commands and scolding him when he ignores them. So naturally, it's best to take good care of Huey, since he's Fiona's only chance of escaping the castle alive. The enemies in Haunting Ground are very memorable and disturbing. Each one has a unique personality and hunting style, which creates an unpredictable set of threats for Fiona. For example, the first stalker that Fiona encounters is Debilitas, a large mentally disabled hunchback dude who likes playing with dolls and who wants to catch Fiona because he thinks she looks like a doll and I guess wants to play with her. While playing this game, it quickly becomes clear that it dives into some pretty unsettling and disturbing themes, and I definitely don't think a game like this would ever be be made today. Throughout Haunting Ground, the story unfolds within the confines of a massive castle. Although each room can vary quite a lot, it's incredibly easy to get lost, speaking from experience, especially when you're panicking and running for your life, which happens a lot in this game. As Fiona, you're basically a walking target the whole game. You're constantly being hunted down while also trying to solve puzzles and find a way to get out of the castle. Despite that, Haunting Ground's horror doesn't rely on cheap jump scares because it simply doesn't have to. The game builds a constant sense of dread through the feeling of always being chased and pursued, and does a good job of keeping the pressure on you. Very rarely do you get long stretches of time where you can relax and figure out what to do next. The enemies can show up at any time, and their arrival is signaled by music since each enemy has their own track that plays when they spot you, giving you just enough time to find a hiding spot or plan your escape. Even though the game does give you some breathing room to roughly figure things out, you never know when an enemy will be searching for you, and there are no safe zones in Haunting Ground. What I also really liked about the game is Fiona's character progression. She starts off terrified and helpless, but as the game goes on, she becomes stronger. It's basically a journey from victim to survivor, which is sort of mirrored in the gameplay as well, as you, the player, also get better at handling the challenges presented to you throughout the game. I had a great time playing Haunting Ground. It's creepy, clever, and has enough depth to keep you hooked. If you love survival horror and haven't played this, you definitely should. It's a hidden gem that deserves more attention. One of the most unique and unusual games I played was Rule of Rose. Rule of Rose is a 2006 survival horror game set in 1930s England, where we follow and slowly learn about the story of our protagonist, a young girl named Jennifer. This game heavily revolves around themes of childhood trauma and abuse, which leads to some pretty unsettling and disturbing stuff throughout the game. The plot of the game basically revolves around Jennifer reliving her painful childhood memories as an adult, or at least how she remembers them. The story is pretty unclear and hard to follow until the end, since the game mostly gives you scattered pieces of lore here and there, and leaves it up to you to figure out what happened. While the plot doesn't offer much in terms of character development, there's definitely enough interesting imagery to keep you immersed. What initially drew me to Rule of Rose, and why it's been so infamous since its release, wasn't the game itself, but the massive controversy surrounding it. It was first released in 2006 by Sony in Japan, but the first signs of trouble came at that year's E3 convention, where Sony's American branch announced they wouldn't release it in the US, calling it incompatible with their image. Even so, the game was published later that year by a different publisher. After its release, however, Rule of Rose sparked yet another wave of controversy, this time in Europe, with the game's unsettling content leading to media claims that triggered somewhat of an international panic. This mostly started when a magazine accused the game of featuring violent and erotic scenes involving children, which caused outrage and pushed some politicians, including the mayor of Rome and the EU's Minister of Justice, to make public statements calling for the game to be banned. As a result, its release was heavily scaled back in many countries, and it was outright banned in places like the UK and Australia. This whole fiasco made physical copies of Rule of Rose incredibly rare, with some now selling for hundreds or even thousands of dollars. The game's story begins with Jennifer stranded outside a mysterious orphanage late at night. Once inside, it quickly becomes clear that this isn't your typical orphanage. It's inhabited by a group of weird, creepy kids led by a gang of schoolgirls called the Red Crayon Aristocrats, who forced Jennifer into servitude on a gigantic, monster-infested airship, demanding she bring them presents under the threat of death. If you think that sounds crazy, let me tell you, it only gets weirder. As you progress through Rule of Rose, the game's narrative becomes increasingly surreal and incomprehensible, with plenty of symbolism and details hidden throughout it. It also jumps around a lot in time, since it has to do with Jennifer's old memories, and much of the plot and the events behind it are only partially explained by the game's end, leaving you to piece together what's really happening. So if you prefer straightforward storylines, this game might not be for you. But even though I found the concept of the game very interesting, and I think its story is captivating enough to keep you engaged, the gameplay definitely left a lot to be desired. As you can see from this clip of my first enemy encounter, where I'm fighting this little munchkin man with a fork. Each chapter in Rule of Rose is different, but your main goal is always to find an offering for the creepy kids. And similar to Haunting Ground, you have a dog companion named Brown to help you out. Brown is actually a pretty solid mechanic. You can equip an item and send him to find items which are associated with it. This means you don't have to search every single room like most survival horror games. At first, I got a little lost on what to do, but once you get Brown, which is almost right away, he finds everything for you. You can't even get certain items until the dog sniffs them out and finds them for you, so you're pretty much relying on him the entire time. But at the same time, it's a good thing the game includes this mechanic, because there's a ton of backtracking. Jennifer moves super slowly, and being stuck on the airship means you're walking through the same environments over and over. Gameplay-wise, it's a basic survival horror game. You find items, solve puzzles, explore a bit, and sometimes fight enemies, mostly with melee weapons. The problem is that every single weapon has such a short reach that you basically have to be right in front of enemies' faces to hit them, and most of the weapons are very weak too. Thankfully, combat isn't a huge part of Rule of Rose, but you'll still have to fight your way out of a few situations, so it can get pretty frustrating at times. It's really a shame that the gameplay is so flawed, almost to the point of being unplayable, because Rule of Rose otherwise is a captivating game. The presentation and aesthetic are amazing, and the subject matter had the potential to make it unforgettable. As it stands though, it's hard to recommend to anyone besides hardcore survival horror fans. One of the weirdest games on this list has got to be Echo Night Beyond. Echo Night Beyond is a 2004 survival horror game developed by From Software. If that name sounds familiar, it's because From Software nowadays is mostly known for creating many of the popular Souls-like games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, or Elden Ring. However, what many people might not know is that before they had their breakout success with the Souls games, they actually made a lot of unique, one-off horror games that to this day remain very overlooked and underappreciated. Echo Night Beyond follows the story of our protagonist, Richard Osmond, who's on a space shuttle with his fiancée to the moon to become the first couple married on its surface. However, things don't go exactly as planned, and the space shuttle they're in ends up crashing. Richard wakes up alone, with his fiancée nowhere to be found. He ends up going through this abandoned lunar base to find her, only to discover it's now full of ghosts. These ghosts are plagued by some kind of weird fog that causes them to become hostile. So as Richard, you gotta carefully navigate the base, face the ghosts, and solve puzzles to figure out what happened at the base, and at the same time, uncover some stuff about your own past. For a game made 20 years ago, Echo Night Beyond has some pretty impressive visuals. The lunar base is detailed with realistic lighting and reflections, which were probably pretty good for the time. That said, I actually prefer the older style graphics way more. The sound design is just as good with unsettling ambient noises and a solid soundtrack. I think the developers were definitely going for a feeling of isolation when creating the atmosphere for this game, and they absolutely nailed it. The setting really captures that sense of loneliness and being trapped, with the futuristic base contrasting sharply against the emptiness and the scattered remnants of human life, like everyone just suddenly disappeared. Echo Night Beyond kind of reminds me of those point-and-click adventure flash games I used to play on the browser when I was little, but in first person, if that makes sense. The gameplay revolves around interacting with ghosts, finding items, and of course, solving puzzles. You'll basically be using objects to repair equipment and unlock new areas, which means there's gonna be a lot of backtracking. It gets pretty tiring, especially since important items are scattered all over the huge space station. Early on, problems and solutions are close by, but as you progress, the distance between them increases, making it pretty easy to miss key items and forcing you to re-explore areas a lot. One of the things that separates this game from other survival horror titles is that you're actually non-violent. You can't just defeat the ghosts. I mean, how would you even fight a ghost anyway? So it's not about killing to move forward. Instead, the main focus is making peace with the ghosts haunting the base. Ghosts usually stay in one spot, and if that area is covered in the mysterious fog that's spread across the base, they might get aggressive. To calm them down, you need to first clear the fog using the ventilation system, and then talk to them to figure out what's keeping them from moving on. Most of the ghosts have a specific worry or memory trapping them in the base, and it's your job to solve their issues and help them move on. Helping a ghost often rewards you with valuable information or essential items, so your interactions with them are meaningful and necessary for progressing through the game. There are two types of ghosts. Friendly ones, who need help locating sentimental people or objects, and aggressive ones, that jump scare you and chase you. When that happens, you've got no choice but to run. The first time I was attacked by a ghost, it was honestly terrifying. Seeing the heartbeat in the space helmet speeding up, my vision slowly darkening, the intense sound effects, it was all very sudden, but after a while the game became less and less scary as I kept playing. Overall, seeing how the story plays out in Echo Night Beyond is pretty engaging, even though the game moves at a slow pace and can leave you scratching your head at times. That said, what really makes this game stand out is its atmosphere. The whole vibe of exploring this huge lunar base all alone is what made me enjoy it so much, and why you might as well.